Good afternoon. Absolute pleasure to be here. And as Niamh just pointed out, we are living through a time of massive change. The last 10 days have been sombre. They've given all of us an opportunity to reflect. And we're reflecting on a time of significant change for our country and our society as the world's eyes have been fixed on the United Kingdom. Significant change, of course, as we mourn the passing of a Queen who's been there for all our lives, and we look to the future of the monarchy, what the new king will mean, and what it will mean in terms of change about how we see ourselves. But of course, at the same time as we have a new monarch, and the world looks at us with fresh eyes, we also have a new government and a new Prime Minister. The third Prime Minister, the fourth Prime Minister indeed, in a matter of just 6 years. And over the course of the last 12 years, we've lived through a period of perhaps unprecedented turbulence in our political and economic lives. If we think back to the economic crash of 2008 and everything that's happened since then, we've seen Brexit and Trump. We've seen massive technological and scientific change. And we've also seen social change transform the way in which we interact with those who wield power and in the way in which media acts as an interpreter to all of us of the decisions that are made in our name and in our lives. And there are few more important media than radio.
Trusted.
And as you can tell, there are a few more important things in media than timing. And the timing of my talk today comes at a period when all of us have just seen British media perhaps at its best. Of course, at a time like over the last 10 days, the BBC has been preeminent in our minds. We can't associate moments like this without the voices of people like Hugh Edwards and David Dimbleby, without tuning in to the BBC. But it's also been the case that the richness of the media response to recent events reflects the fact that the media marketplace has grown dramatically and is changing underneath our feet and around our ears at the same time. I have a background in media. Before I became a politician, I worked in print, in broadcast, for the BBC and television, for Channel 4, and also for the Radio 4 Today programme, what was and probably still is the flagship news and current affairs show on radio. But while I have enormous affection for the Today programme and for the BBC, the world in which I worked for the Today programme in 1994, 1995 has been transformed. It's been transformed technically. I am unimaginably ancient. I was one of those people who, as a radio reporter, still had to use a razor blade in order to ensure that the tape that we were using on the viewers at the time was transformed into the reports that people would listen to on what were the analog stations on which people relied. But now, the unparalleled success of the BBC is complemented by the massive reach and success of commercial radio in the UK. The UK, as everyone in this room knows, is a pioneer in commercial and in particular commercial speech radio. We have a burgeoning plethora of new voices and new platforms that are changing the way in which people consume information and the way in which they make judgments about politics and about current affairs. In the 90s, in the period when I was working for the BBC, its voice was canonical. It was authoritative. It was the first place that people looked to for any breaking news story. And it was BBC voices, indeed BBC accents, that determined what news was and also what the acceptable boundaries of commentary were. But that authority has been complemented now by a new accessibility and a new intimacy in other platforms and other voices. So it's now the case that giants like Global through LBC and also new disruptors like Times Radio have changed the way in which we interact with the news. They've brought both a wider range of broadcasters in, but they've also brought in a new style as well. So to take one of the most celebrated changes that's happened in speech radio recently, the growth that LBC have pioneered, the way in which they've brought in voices, often from the BBC, like Emily Maitlis and John Sopel, and Andrew Marr, of course, but also the way in which they've nurtured their own voices, like James O'Brien and Nick Ferrari. What we've seen there is a move away from the steady, authoritative and stately approach of the BBC towards news, towards something which is more direct, more immediate, and yes, more opinionated as well. Now, that challenges some of our perceptions of broadcasting, because one of the things that we value here, in contrast strikingly to the United States, is that we trust our news because the broadcasting scene has been regulated and policed and is less fractured and less noisy, and therefore, in that sense, it has been a more trusted source of information. And the challenge for all of us is how can we keep that sense of trust that people have, while at the same time welcoming new voices and making the most of the commercial and also the creative opportunities that new technology provides. And I think that we are uniquely placed to do so in the United Kingdom because of both the place of the BBC, but also because of the way in which people listen and interact with media, and in particular with radio here. Polling shows that radio is more trusted than the BBC, sorry, more trusted than television and more trusted than print as a source of news. Polling also shows that while the BBC is still the crown in, or the jewel in the crown of British broadcasting, it is also the case that people trust commercial speech radio just as much to provide them with the information they need. And it's also the case that people trust the news that's shared on music stations, whether it's Capital, KISS, or others, for an opportunity to give them the bite-sized, accessible, but nevertheless trusted insight that they need into major world affairs. Now, some of that, of course, is because we all know, we in this room know, that standing behind that broadcasting landscape is a regulator in Ofcom that is there to ensure that appropriate rules are observed. The future for Ofcom under this new government, I think, will be an interesting one. We have in Melanie Dawes as Chief Executive a public servant whose entire career in the civil service has been dedicated to objectivity, impartiality, and serving the public fairly. But it is also the case that this new government will want to ensure that it looks at everything through the prism of economic growth and commercial opportunity. And so I believe it will probably look at the way in which Ofcom operates to see other regulations, for example, on locally produced content, that need to change in order to make sure that we can have the maximum level of creativity, more new entrants entering the field, those who are already there growing. And it will also be the case that even as they look at that regulation in order to ensure that we can clear away some of the obstacles to growth, they will also want to make sure that impartiality and objectivity and high journalistic standards characterize those who have the opportunity to come into our own homes and to whisper into our own ears. And it is striking that if you do listen to, as I do, a wide range of voices on media, if you look to, for example, Times Radio, it is the case that that show, or the shows that they have, that station, is designed to be a complement and a contrast to the BBC and to Radio 4, but it's not the case that they've gone for shocking or provocative content. What they've sought to do is to ensure that conversations have time to breathe, that there are some voices that perhaps, even if they're not marginalised in the BBC, may not necessarily be given the prominence that the BBC would traditionally give them, that have the chance to be heard, and the chance to be heard at greater length. It's also the case, of course, if you listen to the new LBC content, if you listen to someone like Andrew Marr, he will, of course, begin his show with a monologue, as indeed James O'Brien has pioneered, and that monologue will have all the characteristics of an opinion piece in a newspaper, but it won't be a polemic of the kind that we had in the shock jocks that made American talk radio so conspicuously notorious in the 80s or 90s, and he won't have the edge or the determined attempt to rile that you will get on a Fox News presenter like Tucker Carlson. And I think that's both a reflection of the way in which radio has been regulated in the past, but also a reflection of the temper of the UK audience. We do want that wider range of opinions, but we also want them to operate within the civilized landscape that we've come to know and the radio environment with which we all feel comfortable. And of course, with the growth of podcasting alongside traditional speech radio, there's an opportunity for a greater degree of intimacy, for conversations to breathe that bit more spaciously. But even then, you'll find that the most popular of the podcasts in speech radio tend not to be confrontational. Yes, there's room for opinion, but they don't tend to be, again, the roughy-tufty, ruck and mole style that you might find in other jurisdictions. So until recently, the most popular speech podcast dealing with news and current affairs was The Rest is Politics with Alistair Campbell and Rory Stewart. Now, Alistair is never afraid of combat. I've been on the receiving end of tirades from him, but the approach that he takes in that podcast, I think very effectively complemented by Rory, is that of two veterans of the political scene who are still invested in the arguments, but take a couple of steps back and allow their guests to be heard. Most recently they had, who can imagine this, an absorbing 45-minute conversation with William Hague. Hague himself, not necessarily everyone's cup of tea, Hague himself, an accomplished broadcaster and occasional Times radio contributor, had the opportunity for some good-natured repartee with Alistair at the beginning, but they then moved on to a much longer and deeply interesting set of subjects, including the impact of politics on individuals' mental health, the way in which politicians find the media sometimes acts as aid to getting messages across, but sometimes barrier as well to ensuring that the public can have a proper conversation with those who are in power over them. And again, if you listen to the new News Agents podcast with Emily Maitlis, John Sopel, and Lewis Goodall, or Maitlis, Soaps, and Luigi, as they call themselves to their audience, again you will find that while there's greater scope for them to share their opinions, and you know where they're coming from in the political landscape, they go out of their way to make sure that other voices are heard. And I think there's a lesson there for anyone who's thinking about how speech radio in this country will expand. People no longer want just distant, chilly authority. They do want accessibility. People no longer want just the pure independence of the objective voice. They want intimacy as well. But it would be a mistake to think that people want a polarized and aggressive approach towards speech radio in this country. All the evidence shows that one of the most precious things that radio has is trust. And that the voice in your ear, the people whom you invite into your home, they're people whom you want to regard as friends rather than antagonists, and therefore you want that civilized tone to continue in the conversations that you hear. And that takes me back to the relationship that politicians have with the media, and in particular the challenge facing this new government. There has become a tendency in all broadcasting, and sometimes it's particularly marked on the main morning radio shows, for the presenter to regard the politician as prey. The presenter is prosecutor. The politician is criminal. And the aim of the interview is to get that politician to confess, or if not to confess, to be reduced to a quivering mass of jelly, so that the audience at home can have their scorn and their anger satisfied. Now, sometimes that is justified. Sometimes there are politicians who behave in a way that is near criminal. Sometimes our scorn and anger does need to be given an opportunity to be directed at those in power who may have made mistakes or who may be behaving in a high-handed way. But I think with a new government, I'm not calling for a reset in broadcasting, but just a period for all of us to reflect. We need to give people in politics a chance to explain who they are and what they stand for. We need to make sure that before people make the definitive judgment that they're going to make at a general election, that they've had a chance to hear what politicians are doing and why. And again, one of the things which I think is sometimes, but not always, missing in speech radio is that sense of the analysis of the motive. No one goes into politics because they are driven by a desire for money. No one goes into politics because they expect to be in power forever. People go into politics because they're motivated by idealism. Now, that idealism might come from a very different part of the political spectrum to the one that you as an individual share. And it might be difficult to understand why people take the positions that they do. So take me, or let me rather, take one example. At the moment, there's been a conversation about the government's plan to potentially lift the ban, the cap on bankers' bonuses. At first, during a cost of living crisis, it seems insane that a government should say that most people should exercise pay restraint, but that those people who are worrying about whether or not a Ferrari or a Porsche is a wise investment over the next week should be the one group in our society who should feel that no restraint applies to them at all. It seems to some immoral to others criminal, and certainly to many a bizarre warping of political priorities. But what we need to do is to understand, all of us, why it is that the government is seeking to do it. And there are arguments. I'm not going to try to make the arguments for it, but there are arguments. Arguments about making London, at a time when the globally competitive have a choice to operate in New York or in Singapore or in Frankfurt or in Paris, the place that will attract the greatest amount of talent. There is an argument that ultimately it's not about taxpayers' money. This is the money that those firms earn. And if people are paid more, they pay more in tax, which helps those who are in need of better public services. There is also an argument that once you attempt to intervene in a market like that, instead of actually capping remuneration, what you get are higher salaries everywhere, even as bonuses are capped, and that actually ends up meaning that capital is allocated in a less effective and a less efficient way. And the reason why this government is contemplating these changes is Liz Truss, Kwasi Kwarteng, and the team behind them believe that the single most important thing for this country at this time is economic growth. Now, you or I might think that going for growth, maximizing GDP at the expense of everything else, risks economic and environmental externalities that we find troubling. That might mean greater inequality. It might mean that the drive to meet net zero and to enhance nature is compromised. But we owe it to those who are now in power to be able to explain their case, even as we hear from those who are powerful critics and have an alternative view. And that is part of the challenge for all of us, whether in politics or in media, to make sure that those who wish to make a case for change are heard respectfully, and then the alternative is put with all the vigour that we can muster in order to ensure that free and fair debate succeeds. One final thing before going over to your questions and answers. I talked about the centrality of the BBC in our broadcasting landscape. And I'm one of those people who is an unashamed fan of the BBC. Yes, there are aspects of the way in which the corporation operates that can sometimes be irritating. And yes, there have been occasions in the past when it's behaved in an anti-competitive manner. And those who've been attempting to establish new platforms have found that the BBC's anxiety to control the space in which they're operating has meant that innovation has found it harder than it should to provide citizens with the new experiences that they need. But ultimately, we were blessed to have the BBC in many ways. One, it acts as an anchor. The BBC's traditions, the way in which it values objectivity and independence, even if it doesn't always live up to its values, the fact that it holds to those values means that it is a pole around which others can navigate. The second thing is that the BBC provides a home for, explicitly sets out to be a nursery for, new talent. So some of the voices that I mentioned earlier, Maitlis, Sopel, Goodall, who are now finding a wider room for expression within LBC, those voices, of course, grew up in the BBC, and it was the BBC that provided them with the scaffolding for their careers to succeed and the opportunities for them to become trusted broadcasting voices whose voices we welcome in our ear. But more than just training those journalists, the BBC has also been a nursery for talent when it comes to music as well. So Six Music, which was, of course, as we all know, threatened with closure some time ago as the BBC was looking to make economies, thrives particularly on the basis that it acts as a way of bringing new talent in the tradition of John Peel many years ago on Radio 1. And of course, for a broadcaster like the BBC, there is also in Radio 3, albeit a minority channel, a home also for new talent there in classical composition, performance, and conducting. And without that, I don't believe that the broader ecosystem would be as strong as it is. And that's why I think that balance is the most important thing in broadcasting overall. Balance between new voices and old. Balance between the BBC as an anchor or a pole and new commercial radio, which provides us all with a range of listening experiences that meet a succession of our needs. And it's that balance that also provides the best opportunity for those of you in advertising, because while, of course, the BBC eschews in its high-minded way any hint or taint of the commercial, nevertheless, it is the BBC that provides the talent and provides the backdrop against which the commercial can flourish as well. And the final aspect of balance that I think is important is that balance that all of us observe in the very, very best radio between entertainment and stretch. Entertainment, providing that which is comfortable, easy, and for all of us intimate, and stretch, the shock of the new, the engagement with the innovative, the invitation to think afresh. So the future, I believe, for commercial radio, and in particular for speech broadcasting in Britain, is optimistic. That future depends continually on the right measure of regulation in ensuring that we have a landscape that allows it to flourish. But above all, it depends on recognizing that the British people have good taste, good judgment, and that's one of the reasons why commercial radio flourishes. And it's in that relationship between the British people's taste and judgment and the innovation that people in this room that are responsible for that we can see a bright future for commercial radio. Thank you all very much. Thank you.
Please have a seat. Absolutely fascinating. Now, I don't know how I should refer to you. Do I, Right Honourable
just Michael? Michael.
I think I'd like to call you the Right Honourable Michael, if I may.
Of course.
Thank you so much for that and for answering all of our questions. We have so many. Are you ready? I feel like you're always ready.
I will try.
I feel like you're always ready. So I'm going to go in with possibly my favourite question first. Who is your favourite LBC presenter? Is it Nick Ferrari?
Yes, it is, actually. Spot on. One of the reasons why I like Nick is one of the terrors for any politician is the morning round. So if you're a politician, front bencher on either party, you will every so often be called upon to try to drive the day with the story that your administration or your party is trying to get out there in order to capture headlines. But more often than not, if you're in government, rather than driving the day, you're trying to avoid being driven into a ditch. Because you're on defending the latest Partygate revelation or the latest corruption scandal or whatever. So there you are gamely trying to say that your new initiative on plastic straws is the single most important thing that people should be concentrating on. And of course it will have beneficial environmental consequences in the future. But that morning, all people really want to know is what happened with Boris and the spilt red wine. You will have different people trying different techniques in order to get you back onto that. And one of the people I think who is best and most skillful is Nick Ferrari, because Nick has a tone which is, it's full of bonhomie. He maintains a sense of humour, but then suddenly he will ask the question that completely drives you into that ditch. And talking of driving into a ditch, one of the worst gaffes I ever committed on radio, and there are many, was on the LB show after the Barnard Castle affair. I'm sure you all remember Dominic Cummings, during the height of the pandemic, took his family to Durham, and then before he took them back, he drove to Barnard Castle to test his eyesight. And not for an afternoon's jolly. Anyway, Nick asked me, and I offered my stout defence, and he said, Mr. Gove, have you ever driven to test your eyesight? And I'm a notoriously poor driver, and I wanted to try to stress, if you're a very, very bad driver and your wife and or partner is a better one, then sometimes, it will be different. And I said, well, and before I could say any more, because, of course, the only acceptable answer to that question is, no, don't be ridiculous. There were gales of laughter, not just from Nick, but from everyone in the gallery at that time. And I realized that, in effect, I had, in my desire to avoid saying something stupid, said something truly idiotic. But Nick maintained that sort of equanimity throughout. And I like Nick because he's an utter professional. But he also manages to do it with a smile. But I have to say that there are other LBC presenters whom I admire. I mean, I think Andrew Marr is a peerless broadcaster. And James O'Brien, even though he comes from a different part of the political landscape from me, I think is also a superb broadcaster as well. And I think the tone of voice that he has is one that has understandably won him a huge following.
Thank you. Now, Radio Centre is asking the government to bring in new rules supporting access to radio online. Do you think there will be a media bill which will facilitate this?
Yes, a media bill is planned. It may well be the case that the shape and nature of any media bill changes, because one of the things that Liz Truss and her government are trying to do is to look at the whole legislative programme and try and strip it down. Trying to say, are there things here which may have been done by Boris or others in the past in order to satisfy lobby group A or lobby group B that we no longer need to do? And the first question they will ask is, does it contribute to economic growth overall and the growth of this sector? So they will look at it through a very clear commercial lens. But I suspect that what will count is effective and targeted, not lobbying per se, but persuasion, sharing of information about what really works. And I think one question, and it's certainly above my technical ability to answer, but one key question will be, to what extent does it encourage innovation and bottom-up growth? To what extent are we operating in a way that makes sure that we don't have the Googles and the Amazons of this world and the big platforms either thwarting growth or offering services that mean that the advertising on which smaller commercial stations depend is somehow screened out? That will be the key question. And I think for people attempting to influence Michelle Donlan, Damien Collins and the team at DCMS, I think that the overall question that they will be looking at is, how do we maintain a landscape which is as diverse as possible? And how do we have the opportunity for growth that will benefit both listeners but also companies in the UK?
Thank you, that's exciting. Now, do you find MPs prefer doing interviews on the radio or TV? I would have thought the radio, because you can hide a little bit more. Definitely
the radio.
Poker face.
Definitely the radio. And I think that on TV you simply feel more exposed.
Yeah, you are.
And also, so much of communication is non-verbal. And I remember, this isn't about interviews, but it is about pictures. The morning before Boris fell, the camera was in Downing Street. And there's a clip on every one of, every social media platform out there, as the camera goes round all our faces, with the theme tune from Succession being played. And I didn't know what I was doing, but apparently there was a particular tell that I have when I'm worried, which is that I rub my lips like this. And as the camera went on, you could see my lips jutting out even more than they normally do, and my finger moving even more rapidly than it does, which would have told anyone who knew me, and indeed most people who didn't, that guy's worried.
Something's up.
So he should be. And with TV, you're conscious that there may be other things. You're conscious that there may be those gestures that betray. And you're also conscious that people are making a judgment about how you look and how well you present. But one of the challenges about radio interviews is that, well, the camera's often on you these days as well, if you're in a global studio and so on. But what it can sometimes do is to lull you into a greater sense of intimacy, as we mentioned. And that often means that radio interviewers get more out of people than TV interviewers, because the individual being interviewed is more relaxed.
Absolutely. But it is fun seeing politicians on TV, I must say, especially in the morning.
There is a lot you can tell.
Do you think it's an unattractive career being in politics, with the rise of online trolling, etc., which means shouldn't more be done to regulate social media? Must be a huge problem, I mean.
Well, it is, but I'm wary about over-regulation. So in the aftermath of the tragic murder of David Amos, there was a lot of concern about some of the trolling on social media, but we subsequently discovered that the individual concerned was someone who was motivated by ideology and very possibly mental health issues as well. And it wasn't about Twitter trolling or anything like that. It was about something much darker. There are horrendous things that are said on Twitter and other social media platforms. It is particularly the case, as I think is well observed, that people from black and minority ethnic backgrounds and women in politics suffer disproportionately from online hate. And therefore I'm sympathetic to arguments about how we can attempt to civilise what goes on there. But I'm also wary about things that inhibit free speech, because the thin end of the wedge argument does weigh with me in this area, and I think it may well be that we can find ways in which anonymity can be a less effective cloak. There may be ways in which we can ensure that people who do post offensive content are appropriately, which is directed at an individual, are appropriately punished through the courts. But what I wouldn't want to do is to get to a situation where people feel inhibited about posting general opinions, expressing their understandable anger about things that politicians have done wrong.
Thank you. Any recommendations for a political podcast? I'm not going to start one, because I feel like I wouldn't do a very good job. But do you have any recommendations?
Well, I mentioned two that I do listen to fairly often. So Alistair Campbell and Rory Stewart. I know Rory, I know Alistair, not very well in Alistair's case. I think they've been very successful because they've set out to be honest about themselves and their perceptions. One or two of Alistair's lines can sometimes grate, but he's got a sense of humour. And I think the key success there is they've had a combination of good guests. The guests know they're going to have a proper conversation, so they're not going to get away with it, but neither are they going to be, given the 5-minute roasting that is the stock and trade of those on the morning round. I think the news agents is still finding its feet, and I think that's because there is a breathiness about it, which I'm not sure is absolutely right for podcasts. They operate better, I think, at a different pace. There is a new podcast, and I'll share the details with everyone here afterwards, that a friend just sent me from the US, in which a focus group is run on the issue of the day, and then extracts from the focus group are then discussed with various different political professionals, and so you get into the guts of how politicians make decisions. Something similar has been done by Matt Chorley on Times Radio with James Johnston, and I think that there are an infinite number of ways of helping people to understand how political decisions are made and how ideas and issues influence decision makers. At the moment, as I say, I still think that the rest is politics is the best, but I think that there is scope. And I think one of the things that would be interesting is to have, two recently serving politicians who may have had a curious psychodrama relationship, potentially doing a podcast together, but, who knows.
Brilliant. Do you think MPs use radio enough to connect with the public?
No. And I think that's because politicians are and have been scared. So, one of the things that's frustrating for the listener, I talked about the sometimes confrontational approach taken by presenters, but some of the things that's frustrating is that fear of being exposed, being that quivering mass of jelly, being driven into the ditch, means that sometimes people can be robotic. It takes a little bit of time for politicians to relax into it. And therefore, people hide from the conversations that they should be having. And I think that there is space for people in politics and broadcasters to develop new ways of having those conversations. That doesn't mean that you're letting someone off, it doesn't mean that it's like a sort of smash hits 1980s interview, what's your favourite colour and so on. It does mean that you get a deeper sense of engagement. And I think the other thing also is sometimes if you hear politicians talking to or with one another in a more civilised way, that helps. So again, Times Radio on the Alexis Conran show has a thing at the weekend called Political Frenemies, where you get two MPs from different parties who talk about the things they have in common and the things they disagree on. And that way, if you're interested in politics, it's not everyone's cup of tea, naturally, you get a deeper sense of what motivates people in the public arena.
It must be nerve-wracking, though. This is just a question from me. I'm just curious. It must be nerve-wracking having to always be, I know that's the business of what you do, but having to just be on guard all the time. No wonder people feel a little bit afraid, because they know that the jugular is going to be gone for.
Yes,
scary.
That's true. And of course, you have that guilty feeling, because if you're a politician, you're still a member of a team, your party, the cabinet, the cause for which you're advocating, and you feel just bad in letting them down, as well as feeling embarrassed yourself if you've got things wrong. But the the sheer quantity of outlets now mean that it is easy to recover from a car crash interview. So in the past, there would have been just 1 or 2 major interviews in the morning. If that went badly, that would dominate the news of the day. It's still exquisitely embarrassing if, not so much radio but television, if you've been on with Richard Madeley and you feel you've made a prat of yourself. But there will be other outlets that you will have been on where, provided you've given a good account of yourself overall, then some of the message will get out. So I think in a way, we should welcome the pluralism in media because it just means that every broadcast outing is not an all or nothing moment.
Yes. I think this is going to be our last question. Will you continue in politics after the next election?
Yes, that's my plan. Obviously, it's up to the people who vote for me in Surrey Heath. It may well be that they decide that they've had enough of a Conservative MP and they might want an alternative. But I do want to carry on. And it's partly because being in government is a great privilege, but politics is about more than just what happens to the individuals in government. It's about advocating for particular causes. And during the time that I've been in politics, even though many of the things that I've done have polarised opinions, I've nevertheless felt that you can make a difference in areas like education, criminal justice, the environment, housing, and so I want to carry on playing a part in those debates. And obviously, the place where many of those debates are going to be heard most effectively will be on radio. So I hope I have the chance, Niamh, to be on as many outlets as will have me.
We hope so too. Thank you so much. Thank you again to the Right Honourable Michael Gove. Thank you so much. Thank you.